we're in for an even bigger change in how work works than we think. I just keep getting more convinced that it's going to be even bigger. What feels like something inevitable is people are going to have little armies of agents that are doing things for them. Everyone is going to be an entrepreneur in some ways, or a creator, or a coordinator, or a manager.
Welcome to episode 27 of Tool Use, the weekly conversation about helpful AI tools that you can use today, brought to you by Enetic. I'm Mike Bird, along with Ty Fierro, and this week we're talking about the current state of AI agents, the use cases and limitations for your personal use as well as implementing in your business. This week we're joined by Nathaniel Whittlemore, also known as NLW, the founder and CEO of Superintelligent, as well as the host of my favorite daily AI podcast, the AI Daily Brief. NLW, welcome to Tool Use.
Hey, it's great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Well, we're super glad to have you on. I guess we can kind of kick things off. I think everyone kind of has their own definition of what an agent is. It seems like there's not really a very good definition. I'm kind of curious how you define an agent and kind of what that means to you.
I actually have a super strong point of view on this. You'll find this is a common thread for me. So you see a lot of kind of hand wringing, I think, among people who have been in AI for a long time or who are sort of, more technical experts on how mangled the definition of agent is as it's, found its way into enterprise and stuff. And I actually think that we should not care about that. I think that when people on average are talking about agents or referring to agents, they're bucketing AI into two categories: AI that I have to use and AI that does stuff for me, right? Like without me having to really, tell it, other than maybe that one first time. And obviously that's, not super precise, but I think broadly it gets people kind of in the way to think about it. Like particularly if you're, an enterprise leader and you're thinking about whether you're going to deploy, kind of a assistant style AI or agents, like they really kind of broadly bucket into those two categories. I also think that we've so rarely had as much like narrative consolidation around a single term that's like kind of in the ballpark that the fact that everyone kind of knows this term and is there like trying to kind of like, get into the nitty gritty between agent and automation, I just think is ultimately sort of a not particularly relevant pursuit. I think what people are looking for when they're talking about agents is stuff that actually takes big chunks of work off the table for me, not just makes me do that work better.
Yeah, I found it something similar too, where people will say, oh, the newest agent from OpenAI, Deep Research, which I've used and is great. And then other people say like, well, what about code interpreter? Is that an agent? And ultimately it doesn't matter whether it's a tool or a workflow, as long as it solves a certain task for you. Through your use of them, what type of use cases are you excited for? What have you found to be actually helpful in the current state?
So we think a lot. So the main product right now that Superintelligent is being hit up for is something we call the agent readiness audit, which is basically an agentified process of looking across an organization's workflows and its procedures, its policies, to help them understand what they need to do to be ready to use agents and which agent use cases might be a good fit for them based on current capabilities. And I think that what we often end up kind of, what ends up getting shared with them is, we have these grand ideas of these sort of multi-agent workflows that are orchestrated perfectly and take, giant chunks of tasks off. And that's really just not where things are. Where things are right now is still in this sort of discrete task, repetitive discrete task that you can do, that you have to do over and over and over again. And I think that the more that people and companies experiment, with that in mind, the better suited they're going to be to actually, taking advantage of where agents are now. I think it's going to change dramatically over the course of this year, right? So really single purpose, very specific agents. I think the way that I think about it, sort of from a personal perspective is, we haven't really agentified a ton of the like podcast processes yet. We use AI for a bunch of them, but they're sort of like not fully automated. I think that when it comes to building Superintelligent, we're in the midst of going through and sort of totally reevaluating how everything gets done and actually trying to embed agentic workflows in how we work, right? So the way that we build the products is changing, based on Cursor and sort of, different approaches there. We have, the knowledge base that powers this agent readiness audit is a workflow that sort of automates a set of different agents or automations or however you want to do it. There's a Zapier piece and, a couple other pieces that all add up to automatically extracting information from the web around current agent capabilities that happens every day. So we're kind of going one by one through all the things that we're doing and just asking which parts of this could be sort of supported by, augmented by, or replaced by an agent, and trying to redesign on that basis.
That's really smart. Yeah, we've played a little bit with like trying to use agents for kind of optimizing some of the podcast tasks. And I think we have so much experience with AI that we kind of think in workflows and we think of agents and we kind of know what they're capable of. Some people we talk to like have almost no experience in AI other than like the one chat GPT conversation they've had. And so like even just understanding where AI like fits into their equation, into their business is kind of a difficult thing. Like where do you start with someone that doesn't have a lot of experience in AI? Like how do you kind of explain the benefit to them and how they can get started? Like what's one thing that they could start like this week with AI?
One of the things that often comes up, and this has been the case for some time, and is sort of not agent related, is people underestimate the value of some very basic use cases. So we did a survey of Superintelligent users a while back, and the number one use case for AI across this set of enterprise users was brainstorming, right? Basically making their work better by having ChatGPT act as like a consultant or a thought partner as they were thinking through things, right? And this is going to evolve over time. I think, an interesting analogy is sort of like imagine the marketing or social media that you guys do for the podcast. You've probably shifted, I would imagine, from doing it totally raw yourself to now like partnering with ChatGPT on some of the copy and using Midjourney for some of the images. And so it's like now it's sort of this AI enabled process. It's an AI assisted process where maybe the time has gone down, but I bet the benefit is more just sort of like quality increase and cognitive load decrease for you guys. However, I would imagine that over the course of the next year or so, we'll all be able to actually, I think that, social media agent seems like one of the easiest to actually execute against. How many tweets per day do you want? What do you want them to relate to? How much are they replies versus this? Like you could kind of see how it comes together pretty quickly. What's the database that I have to pull from of previous messages? And so you're kind of going to see that process. And so if people are just getting started, just using the assisted level AI to, see how it makes their work better before they worry too much about even time saving necessarily, I think is often a really good starting point.
Yeah, absolutely. And I've even seen the progression where you have those chats with Claude or ChatGPT to get some input, help with the brainstorming, coming up with titles, to creating a Claude project when you can upload a bunch of documents, a bunch of standards and best practices so you can get more consistent results over time. We've also experimented with the AI editors, and we've yet to find success there. But it's interesting how the chasm between what works today and what is, not quite working, what's a little ways off, is just shrinking by the day.
Yeah.
Have you noticed any tools in your workflow that have really allowed you to completely offset a process, or are you still a human in the loop a lot of the time for these type of things?
So the thing that's closest right now in the super intelligent world is the automation of this knowledge base around current agent capabilities. So when we're trying to match, so like this agent readiness audit, basically the way that it works is a company will come to us and we'll talk to them, and then we deploy a voice agent that does this interview where we've customized the set of questions, and we can do this a very small handful of times and just get a very kind of high level overview. Or we can deploy it all the way down to the employee level across hundreds or even thousands of people, right? You get all of this information. And then based on the interviews with all those people, we're running that through this knowledge base of agentic opportunities that includes, what the agent is, what it does, what use cases are related to it, what industries are related to it, what compliance regimes that, like it fits with, what tech stacks it matters to. So it's sort of like, it's not just like the 2 or 3 kind of vectors that you might imagine, it's like a database of like, I don't know, 20 or 50 rows or something like that, around all this information that we're trying to gather. And we've really like hyper automated the process of ingesting that information. Now we still have an additional layer of human interaction. So for example, like a lot of the subjective information that I get as relates to agents comes from Twitter/X, right? Like people saying, oh, this sucks. Oh, this is great. And that's actually quite useful to try to benchmark like where a thing is when you're trying to give a company an expectation of whether they should be using it or not. Like if subjectively, like half the sentiment on Twitter is that it's great and half the sentiment is bad, you can go in with the appropriate expectations. We're not sure how ready for prime time it is. It might be like slightly over promising or whatever. So it's not fully automated in the sense that there's things that are still much more valuable for kind of like the human to do. But it's getting there, right? And I think that's an important piece. when it comes to the podcast, there's nothing that's fully automated, although I did an experiment last week when I got sick of a much more automated process. So basically, I had pretty much lost my voice. And so I took a topic, used deep research to write, a paper on it. I think the one that I ended up using, I tried a couple, and the one I ended up using was what economic predictions in the era of AGI, basically how AGI is going to impact the economic landscape. Wrote a research paper on it with deep research, and then fed that into Google's Notebook LM and let them turn it into to podcast. And that's what I published that day as an experiment. It went over reasonably. It was, sort of a cute idea. So I don't think I'm going to be turning back to that too frequently. When I think about where automations might come in the future for the AI Daily Brief, I think that there's probably not for my show, because so much of it is like the context that I add implicitly around things. But news podcasts are going to be very easy to go from, for the automated feed that curates them and just turns it, end to end pipeline into a podcast that gets pushed out. It's a very, very sort of simple set of steps that each requires their own automation, but you could do it really effectively.
Yeah, absolutely. And as a longtime listener, I can tell you that the added personality, the added perspective always helps, besides just, an information dump. I actually wouldn't mind double click on deep research, because I've also used it, had positive results. But as you mentioned, the Twitter vibe test, a lot of people didn't seem to like it. A lot of people did, but it was one of those right down the middle ones. What's your experience been like with it? Do you think it's a step in the right direction? And even just like long running AI processes in general, do you think that's the future?
Yeah, I think it's part of the future for sure. I think that we're going to have to do a lot of experimenting and iterating to figure out exactly how these things work. My sense is that most of the people who have had positive experiences with deep research have used it for particular types of knowledge, summarization that it was well suited to do. And the people who have had bad experiences have started to figure out the jagged edges of where it's not so good, right? So it's very clear that like not having access to contemporary journals is a huge problem, right? It really like limits its ability to be super deep and contemporary when it comes to science or anything that requires access to, journals that are behind paywalls. The other thing that I found is that when it comes to really like fast moving spaces, there are, it can be a challenge. So for example, this AGI thing that I did, it was mostly great. However, it was definitely like over reliant on Nick Bostrom's superintelligence, as a resource. And I think at one point it said that most scientists still think that AGI is a decade or two away, which is obviously like so not it's not reading Twitter. Let's put it that way. So I think that there's we're just going to figure out like basically research or, grabbing a bunch of sources and turning them into a consolidated bucket of knowledge is actually a very diverse use case. It's not one use case. It's about 1,000 use cases embedded in one category of use case that it's going to take some time for us to figure out what pieces of it this particular tool is actually good at.
I've enjoyed deep research so far. I think there's limitations. I think what's also weird is some of the limitations are like when it hallucinates, it's hard to know that it actually hallucinated. Like it's like in these areas that I'm not an expert at, like it could just say something and then cite the reference. And I'm like, oh yeah, that's true because it read the thing, right? So it's like, it's so much harder to spot these hallucinations. And I feel like hallucinations are still an issue in the world of AI. And I feel like that's something that we're still trying to solve. How big of an issue is hallucinations, do you think? And is that like a primary complaint that you see with businesses?
Yeah, it's actually a much bigger deal for businesses than it is for consumers, I think. Consumers have a higher kind of threshold for what they can deal with, especially if it's, so much of the deep research use case isn't trying to get something that's production ready. It's trying to get a kind of a thing that gets to 80 or 90%, right? So one of the use cases that I've seen a number of people have success with is basically background market descriptions and sizing for their startups, right? So they're trying to communicate and understand like how big the total addressable market for the thing that they're building is. And, it's really good at pulling a bunch of different resources in, blah, 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 blah. But they're never going to just turn that over to an investor. At least if they're actually a good entrepreneur, they're not going to just turn it over to an investor. But it saves them a huge amount of time. Like I said, it gets them kind of 80% of the way there. And so for them, they're maybe more in a position to actually spot those hallucinations. Where hallucinations become a real problem is when people are actually, basically replacing a human information source with an AI or an agent information source that is really relies on having the right information. So an insurance company that we work with found that the sort of like the threshold of tolerance that people had for a human agent being wrong when they were giving them information was like 5% of the time, 7% of the time, something like that. Whereas with a robot basically giving them that information, it was like less than 1%, right? People expect it to be absolutely perfect. And in certain cases, if you're in kind of like a highly regulated industry, the barrier is extra high because if you give bad advice, if you think medicine, insurance, I mean anything like that, the threshold is just extremely high. So hallucination is one of those weird things where it's like it's often just kind of funny and silly when it comes to consumers, but is a major detriment to how far into deployment and production certain use cases can be for big enterprises.
Absolutely. I've kind of tried to teach people to view it as like Wikipedia. Use it to get started, but it's not something you can put as a reference in your paper.
Mhm.
In regards to the hallucinations, a lot of people try to solve this with evals or just build enough of a robust eval set that they're able to kind of mitigate against some of the risk of hallucinations. Do you find businesses are implementing any other types of strategies, or are they even following through with the evals, or just kind of YOLOing it? What's the vibe in the business community?
I think that evals are still actually underutilized. I think that a lot of companies like they're just now coming to understand what the full stack of things they have to do to actually implement these tools. And one of the things that's frustrating or can be frustrating is when you realize you have to like you can't just build the thing, you have to build this other set of infrastructure to support the thing to make the thing work, and they're like there's often a resistance to that. I mean, all of the custom build shops that are, that are either building custom agents or helping deploy things, they always complain about how, the budgets end when you get to evals and they don't want to, kind of put those into practice. So I think that even evals are there. To your point, I think that using them is a whole different issue. I think that the way that this will be most addressed in the short term, which it sort of has it's kind of good for a number of reasons. I think that you're going to see humans in the loop for much longer than they theoretically need to be to help solve and spot this. And I think that human in the loop is, in addition to it just being a solve for technical problems of I also think it's a transitional tool to slow down the sort of like rate of full task and work replacement that AI could possibly do. Right, it creates a mechanism for continued human presence even on areas that are being highly automated, which then doesn't solve all the issues for job replacement and things like that. But I think that we will over-index on things like that even more than are necessary because society is going to have to find ways to slow down what AI could do from a replacement perspective.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. I do share the sentiment that evals are very underutilized. It's kind of remarkable to me how many, even like startups aren't using very many evals. I feel like probably less than 10% of startups are using like true eval suites. It kind of brings me to my next question of like, what mistakes do you see most often when businesses try to implement AI? I think there's obviously, there's hallucination, maybe over engineering, but I'm curious what like are the primary mistakes you see when businesses are trying to implement agents?
There's a lot of things. So if you look at what companies view as their biggest challenges with AI right now, kind of broadly speaking, the three that tend to come up are one, like data readiness and whatever complex set of things that means. Like is their data all in the same place? Is it ready to be used? I mean, this is a huge industry dealing with just that problem. The second is everything surrounding privacy, cybersecurity, all that sort of set of issues. And then the third is employee adoption and utilization. And usually it's sort of like in that order, roughly speaking. One of the things that you see constantly is, company X will have 10,000 Microsoft Copilot subscriptions, but only 33% of them are being used or something like that. And there's just no real support infrastructure. There's no enablement infrastructure surrounding that sort of utilization. And I think that that's just a market gap that is very, that is starting to be filled. I mean, this is sort of the space that Super plays in, obviously. But it just needs, needs more people building more things in that space that can support, adoption and implementation. So that's a big challenge. I think when it comes to agents, what we're going to see is sort of a lot of we're going to have a misalignment of expectations. I think people are going to try to sort of, or they're going to imagine that they can do more than they can to start. And I think that they'll try to create these very complex systems right out of the gate that won't quite work. Yeah, there's probably a bunch more that I can think of as well.
I wouldn't mind diving into the security aspect a little bit. We're familiar with this one project, an open source project, a CodeGate, which kind of acts as a local proxy that your LLM requests route through so it can redact PII and stuff like that. But it just seems to be just getting started. Do you have any either tools or advice for companies that are concerned about security and bringing LLMs into their workflow?
I think that I would, at any given time when anyone is listening to this, I think it's really worthwhile to go try to do an audit of what tools are available in that space, because this is so clearly such a massively juicy problem that, there are startups now, there are going to be more startups in 3 months, there's going to be many more startups in 6 months. They're all going to be taking different approaches to this or slightly different approaches to this. There's a full a full sort of spectrum of options of available support to the extent that people want to solve that now. Like there's companies that will come in and build things completely on premise. I mean, there's just a ton of options. I think that one thing that's interesting that's happening with this sort of technology shift that maybe didn't in quite the same way in previous eras is companies are building a lot more than just buying off the shelf than they have in the past. So Menlo did a study, their enterprise adoption study, and between 23 and 24, the rate of build versus buy, there was a huge shift. So in 23, it was something like 80 buy, 20 build. And then last year, it was 53 buy, 47 build. So, I mean, huge shift. Now, I think that this boomerangs back. I think that what that reflects is verticalized solutions and verticalized agents not quite being ready for prime time yet. And so companies that are in those verticals or that are thinking about those functions, seeing the opportunity, racing to build it, because there's all these frameworks that are available to them. But what I think will happen naturally is that winners will emerge in the category that they had started to build in, and then they'll naturally shift back over to whatever sort of the market leader is. But that it does create this whole interesting dynamic. And because of that, I think that one of the ways that people are more emboldened to solve some of these issues is if they can't get there with the available kind of security profiles of third-party vendors, there are options more than perhaps in the past that are accessible for, kind of rolling your own solution that, that just has the kind of highest level of security that you can have.
Yeah, and just on the note of vertical agents, do you see there's still room in the space for more horizontal AI offerings, or do you think it's going to be everything's becoming a vertical, and then the big foundational providers like OpenAI are going to just massively dominate the horizontal, or do you think there's still room for startups in that space?
I have no idea. I think that it is very clear, or it seems pretty clear, that technology is a very hard moat in this world, right? Like, I mean, even for the foundation model companies, it's like, if you inch ahead, everyone catches up to you a couple months later. And so when I look at these solutions that are going to kind of capture big sets of value in the enterprise space in particular, I think that it's going to be based on it's going to have other types of differentiation than just pure technology differentiation at first, right? There'll be some privileged distribution channel that gets them in the door faster. And, there'll be some nature of the product that creates some sort of lock-in. There'll be data differences, that sort of like extend the lead because they have access to some data that actually informs the output of the product on the other side. That's actually valuable, right? Like sort of the data exhaust that comes from usage. And so I think that there probably is more room than people might think for the non-foundation companies to compete. You also are seeing you're seeing companies who are playing at a very core level, even though they're not foundation level companies, having a lot of success. Like Glean just hit 100 million ARR, I think. And a lot, they are trying to build basically that flat horizontal suite of everything that enterprises need, which is a really tough road to hoe, but it's working, right? At least for them, they're doing a good job. So, I think that it's TBD how this all shakes out. I do think obviously it's just going to be a constant carnage of, AIs, I mean, the one that seems like it's going to be particularly brutal is like the sales agents and stuff. There's so many companies in that space. And OpenAI decides that they really want to go after that as core functionality, which feels like they might, that feels like it's going to be a tough one to compete.
I even saw that tweet on Twitter that was like the leak of OpenAI sales agent from Tokyo or whatever. So it seems like these bigger companies might even get into the more vertical spaces. One of my big, I think, issues with AI adoption right now is kind of this like cultural readiness aspect. I feel like my partner used to not use AI at all just because it was kind of like she was like scared of it, right? And didn't really want to use AI because it felt like it was using the thing that might replace him. So I feel like there's some amount of like cultural readiness that's kind of really required for like large scale adoption for AI agents. Do you see any like rebranding necessary or like any like tips on how to get like or how to brand agents as something more digestible for like your average consumer?
Yeah, absolutely. So it's a huge issue. One of the things that we do when we sort of do our full audits and we get down on that employee level is we survey about attitudes towards agents and fears and customizations. And again, when people are verbalizing, they're more comfortable kind of talking extensively about this than if they were just sort of filling out a survey. So we get some really interesting insights. I think this is going to have to be, in most cases, a leadership. This is a leadership question. The way that people are smart. There's no way to rebrand agents to not be cheaper human labor. They are. The question is what companies do with the savings they get from that labor replacement, because that's not a foregone conclusion. Companies can decide to do the exact same amount of work with just at a cheaper cost, right? And I think that this will be an inevitable phase that we go through. Lots of companies are going to do this. The stock market in the short term will reward a lot of that, right? Like you cut $2 billion off your bottom line, or off your budget because of agents. The markets will love that in the short term. But I think that the companies that win in the long term are the ones who are going to reinvest the savings that they get in developing new products, new levels of services that weren't possible before, right? Like innovate and think in different ways. And to the extent that a company is thinking like that, they have to communicate it, right? Like if you're a company that says, we want to use agents because there's entire big chunks of the things that we spend our time on that are crap, but it's not because we're trying to cut down on our staff. Like you got to say that. And people are still going to be skeptical, but at least if you articulate it, if you put it, in writing, in speeches and statements, it's something that gives people confidence. So I can't see any way for it to be anything other than a leadership issue.
I feel like the communication around that's really important. I kind of want to go back to what you said about the, like a company buys 10,000 seats of Copilot and only 20% of the employees actually use it. And there's this 80% of them that aren't actually using it. And I'm like kind of curious. This kind of feels like maybe that's part of the cultural readiness thing, but I'm kind of curious about the build versus buy. Would they have more adoption of their own tools if they would have just built their own thing instead of buying something off the shelf?
No, it's so I have examples where the answer is yes. We've seen, so one of the things that a lot of people kind of built early on was some version of like a chat with your data, like basically build a RAG database of all the company's documents and you can go in and interact with it, right? And I've seen, I've seen companies have success with that. I think because they promote it way more, because it's like that they took the time to build it and they invested in it. And so it's like there's an active internal marketing campaign to get people to use that. Second, those build tools tend to implicitly have use cases embedded in them, right? So it's like, it's usually not someone who's just like, rebuilding ChatGPT. In fact, those experiments have done pretty poorly. I think Bloomberg early on tried to build like their own version of ChatGPT with financial data and it just flopped. So most of the build projects are more discrete and they have a specific use case. So the people don't have to do as much use case imagining or creating, right? They can just sort of, if they need to do that thing, they can go do that thing. I think that a lot of the problems of the general tools like Copilot do come down to not like, how do I use this? Or like, do I know how to use this from a practical standpoint? It's like, what am I supposed to use this for? Right? Like, what is the use case? Like, if you think about how technology is normally figured out, a tiny, tiny fraction of people like figure out the use cases or the modalities and everyone else just copies them, right? Like on any social network, it's a tiny, tiny fraction of people that like come up with a new trend or figure the thing out, and then just everyone else copies them. We've created a situation for enterprise AI, especially, where we expect everyone to be a use case creator. We hand them Copilot with a blank page and say, like, go use it for value. Which this is why a core service of Super is sort of this use case sharing platform where you just let people copy off the homework of the people who have figured it out. So I think that there's a bunch of different solutions to this. They all sort of come down to make it easier for people and just be really specific and clear about where they're going to get value from these things and let them do that thing, kind of over and over again.
And I imagine there's a range of this, but in your experience, what's the general time for adopting these AI tools, from the decision being made to deciding on which service to go to educating the team? How long does that usually take a company to go from like, I want this, to actually in production benefiting from it?
There's no one specific time. What I would say is that it's a lot faster than previous tool cycles, right? Like enterprises have really jumped on this with both hands. They've moved fast relative to them. So even if like the answer to that is 3 to 6 months in certain cases, that would probably have been a couple years, in the past, right? Like they are hyper accelerating this relative to them. I think with agents, it's going to be a little bit different. I think that there's going to be a more extensive experimentation process, especially this year and next year, that leads to their ability to spin up and deploy agents at a much quicker clip going forward after that.
That makes a lot of sense. I think there's so much information on Twitter, and there's so many new launches every single day, and there's so much information coming out, that I think with more information that we get, the better we're getting at actually like kind of forecasting what's coming. Would you see anything on the horizon that's going to like massively improve agents, or like what are you most excited for the next year, and like technology unlocks for agents and model companies?
I think there's going to be a huge amount of upgrade of infrastructure at the enterprise level, right? Like all the things that you need to deploy agents well are going to start to be put into place. I think that the sort of the startup infrastructure around frameworks that exists outside of companies, right? So not your data readiness, but like your observability stack and your performance measurement and all these, your cost optimization, all of that's going to come online. So kind of like even without any change in the capability of these agents, there's a bunch of reasons to think that they'll be improved in their ability to sort of intersect and work inside of workflows. I think a third thing is that you have the verticalization of everything is companies it's being driven by companies that believe they have some particular insight on how the user experience of the agent should work in the use case context. So it's not as, they are basically bringing that pre-existing knowledge that comes from probably working in that industry or in that function. And I think that there's a lot of upgrades that you get just from an interface perspective, right? Like think about what a big upgrade it was to have projects in Anthropic, like you were talking about, right? Like no change in the underlying capabilities, but a huge upgrade in the interface. One of the small little features that I love in Claude is the fact that you now have like the little database of voices that you can toggle between right at the bottom, right? That's theoretically unnecessary because you could just input all that, via chat, but it's a great interface update. And I think that you're going to see those sort of interface improvements across all of these different vertical and functional agents. And then there's the model question. And I have no specific knowledge, but boy, it certainly seems like all of these companies and all of these big labs are representing that there are big jumps to come in the near future. You can feel the acceleration kind of, happening right now. And so I wouldn't be surprised if we saw some pretty significant upgrades in just, core capabilities over the next year as well.
Yep. One of the points I'd like to dive into, because great prediction, I very much align, but it's the UI aspect. You mentioned Claude projects. Claude artifacts are another one where it just completely changed the game to have a separate document that can be updated and edited instead of like a main chat window. Cursor has taken off where just all they did was bring a little chat interface into VS Code, then introduce tab, and just made your coding experience very smooth without having to introduce a major new paradigm. Ty and I both said in multiple episodes, we use voice to interact with our computer way more than we used to, whether it's Super Whisper to simply transcribe or using something like Open Interpreter where we can actually issue commands to have tasks done. Voice has just completely changed it. Where do you see either a gap in interface to where user interface and to where it could go, or just general trends as to how people are interacting with AI in ways that they weren't able to interact with the computer before?
Yeah. So I think that I think that that we'll actually be running in two totally different directions at once. We'll be adding buttons back in a lot of places, right? Like as we figure out like specific environments, for specific types of use cases, I think a lot of times there will be like, it'll make sense to just have a set of controls that are standard, that you can just press a button to use. So I think that we'll see like almost like a retroification of some of these user interfaces on the one hand, and then on the other hand, I think that we are still way under indexing on voice. To your point, I think that it's a new paradigm for a lot of us, depending on different people's age. I think obviously like the younger you are from a generational perspective, the more comfortable probably you are with voice because it's been more of a paradigm, for talk to text and things like that. But I think that we're still way under indexing on voice, and voice is going to be a huge unlock for a lot of different types of projects and products over the course of the next year or two.
I so agree. I spent so much time just vibe coding with Super Whisper and Cursor and just talking to my computer and just kind of like asking it for the things that I want, and just kind of it does great with these walls of unstructured just voice text and just kind of understands what you're talking about. I absolutely agree with the voice sentiment. I think one last question for me is, on Twitter recently, there's been a lot of talk about agency and how agency is kind of like the most important trait right now to have as an entrepreneur and as someone in this day and age. And like, what could you do right now to 10x your agency? I'm curious what mindset shifts and like what mindsets are the most important for entrepreneurs and like some of these younger builders trying to build applications and going into 2025.
I think maybe I'll answer the question in two ways. One is sort of specific for entrepreneurs. This thing that's enormously hard to do is trying to design for a world where everything is way cheaper, like all intelligence is way cheaper and the capabilities are way higher. I think that a huge portion of the companies that we look back on, or startups that will have failed during kind of the 22 to 27 period, will have over-indexed on the place that AI was at that moment versus where it was likely to be in 12 months, which is a super hard thing to get, but like this is a classic skate to where the puck is going, but it's moving so fast that if you're just filling in gaps now, it's going to be very, very hard. Whereas again, if you're trying to kind of like really imagine how different the future can be and design for that, you obviously run the risk of being too early, but I think that the risk of being too late and sort of missing a thing is much higher right now than being too early. And so that's one thing from strictly from an entrepreneur perspective as relates to mindset. I think more broadly, something that just seems fairly clear to me that I don't know has been fully embraced because it's such a radical change. I think that we're in for an even bigger change in how work works than we think. I just keep getting more convinced that it's going to be even bigger rather than smaller. And one of what feels like something inevitable is presumably people are going to have little armies of agents that are doing things for them. Like everyone is going to be an entrepreneur in some ways, or a creator, or a coordinator, or a manager. And managing a group of resources and people who do things is incredibly difficult, right? Like it's hard to delegate. It's hard to figure out how to make things work together. It's hard to manage teams. It's why like only a small portion of people do it. But if you look across like the sum total of, white collar workers, not many of them are managing at mass scale. Most of them are just doing things, right? And I think that we're basically all going to have to become coordinators and managers and project managers, and that's a very different skill set. That's not just about prompting or something like that. That's actually sort of a fundamental shift in how you think about your role. That I think that the more that people kind of grok with that, the faster they are. Like every coder is now actually sort of for coders, that they are themselves and their team. But it's hard to shift into that mindset. It's hard to think like that.
Yep, agreed. Last one for me. You run a business to help teach people about all things AI, how to use in their personal life, how to use in their business. You do the daily podcast to keep people updated on the news, with it being the fastest moving industry that humans have ever experienced. Do you have any tips or strategies for how you can not get overwhelmed with a fire hose of information and actually consume and filter what's important and then actually learn how to like apply it to your benefit?
You have to pick your sources, and obviously I have one of them with the daily brief, but like if you just read the information, right, and you said, I'm not going to look at anything else, or like you pick the 3 people on Twitter that you follow or whatever it is, right? Like you're going to mostly catch the sort of big key stuff. No one needs to know every new tool that's come out necessarily. Like things will surface to the top. I think that the on an information overload perspective, you just got to pick your sources and be comfortable with them. Now, to the extent that they start to sort of fail you, then you shift to other sources, but that's one thing. Then on the applied side, it is just you got to start by starting. You got to try by trying. You got to do by doing. Like there's just no substitute. In fact, I mean, part of the reason that Superintelligent has shifted so aggressively away from tutorials and education in a traditional sense to, to a bunch of different modes of helping people is I just don't think that the traditional paradigm of learning over here and practice over here is long for this world. I think it's just going to be all doing and agents sitting there talking to you, talking about how you could do it differently and do it better. So the more that you start doing, the faster you start moving, I think that the better it is. And luckily, it doesn't have to be high stakes. Like, I think one of the things that is very clear is that a huge portion of people who later bring AI into their work start with personal use cases, right? They start creating bedtime stories for their kids, or illustrating, I don't know, their band posters that they play with their buddies on the weekend, or whatever it is with Midjourney, right? Like, and then they move over. So it's not like you have to go high stakes right at the beginning. It's not like you have to figure out how to change everything about your work to start. But I think that you do need to start. The less that you're engaged with this stuff, the farther behind you're falling.
Absolutely. Well, Nathaniel, really appreciate having you on. Before we let you go, is there anything you want the audience to know?
No, I mean, I've accidentally shilled the company a million times. If you want to check it out, it's bsuper.ai. Podcast is AI Daily Brief. I'm NLW on every network. So appreciate you guys having me, and excited for all of your listeners to go on the AI journey.
We super appreciate you coming on, and we'd love to have you on again in the future.